If there's one thing we know about entertainment, it's that sex sells. If there's one thing we know about our Catholic Church, it's that our teachings are often misunderstood. And since Catholicism in Focus is a form of entertainment that tries to clarify misunderstandings, I think an episode about sex is really gonna score, eh? See what I did there? Okay, sorry, that was really lame. Given that the topic is immense and could never be fully explained in just a few minutes, why don't we focus on a simple question people ask all the time? What are we allowed to, do and remain faithful Catholics? This is Catholicism in Focus. Before we begin, I should warn any parents or teachers watching with any minors that this video is in fact about sex. If you think that they're not ready to hear such things or you'd rather teach them yourself, I advise you to switch to a different video like this one. Besides being an interesting topic in its own right, full of intrigue and excitement, sex within the Catholic Church is especially fascinating because the outside world tends to misunderstand what we're actually saying and why we're saying it. For instance, many find our church repressive or prudish, thinking that we don't like sex. We've been ridiculed for being too restrictive, prohibiting certain sexual acts such as oral sex or masturbation, forbidding the use of artificial birth control or artificial means of conception, requiring celibacy for priests and bishops, and of course, not recognizing same-sex unions as valid. And while all of these things are true, the fact of the matter is that the Catholic Church actually loves sex, really. There is probably no church or organization in the world that has thought more about it or has worked to integrate our sexuality with our life with God and our responsibility to work for the common good. Not once in our history has sex ever been described as a bad thing. Truly, sex is a tremendously good thing. What other act can produce new life? What other act is quite as powerful at uniting people in ecstatic love? For us, the question is not whether or not sex is good. It's clear that it is. In fact, it might be the most good thing that we could do. Our question is simply one of reverence. How do we engage in it consciously, responsibly, and morally, so to not diminish the powerful act down to nothing more than pleasure? Sex is pleasurable, but it's much more than that. According to Catholic moral theology, there are two principal ends that guide all appropriate sexual activity. This particular doctrine, often expounded by the magisterium of the Church, is based on the inseparable connection, established by God, which man on his own initiative may not break, between the unitive significance and the procreative significance, which are both inherent to the marriage act. When the Church says that a sexual act must be unitive in nature, what it means is that it serves as an act of complementary self-giving that draws the couple together in love. Including pleasure, but going beyond this, sexual activity should engender selflessness, promote fidelity, and represent the pinnacle of friendship, the complete handing over of oneself to another. Sexual activity should symbolize as much as it constitutes the fullness of love between two people, and is thus not something that should ever be engaged in casually. Unless two people have entered into the covenant of marriage before God and are using the activity to grow in that covenant, sex should be avoided. Of course, love as powerful as this is not something that could ever be held in isolation or kept for itself, and true love naturally leads to bearing fruit. For an act to be morally good, it must also honor the power of sex to produce life. Fecundity is a gift, an end of marriage, for conjugal love naturally tends to be fruitful. A child does not come from outside as something added on to the mutual love of the spouses, but springs from the very heart of that mutual giving as its fruit and fulfillment. So the Church, which is on the side of life, teaches that it is necessary that each and every marriage act remain ordered per se to the procreation of human life. In other words, we believe God created sex for the purpose of producing children out of unitive love, and so to use it for anything other than what God intended is problematic. There might be great secondary effects, pleasure, a good source of exercise, relief of stress, and we are allowed to enjoy these things. But when they are sought for their own sake, at the expense of what God naturally intends, something grave has been lost. For this reason, the Church insists that these two factors are essential for sexual activity and are inseparable. Unitive love without openness to new life is not the fullness of unitive love, and a willingness to welcome new life without a foundation of love is not the fullness of being open to life. Without both ends fulfilling one another, the act is less than ideal. Returning then to the question at hand, what can, we do and remain faithful Catholics? We see that there are quite a few things that would fail this test. Things that are unitive but not procreative, such as reaching climax by any means that cannot potentially result in conception, are prohibited. Things like oral and anal stimulation are allowed to the extent that they serve as a precursor to sexual intercourse, but as ends in themselves, they fail to fulfill an openness to producing life and are thus insufficient. Similarly, using artificial contraception methods for the purpose of preventing pregnancy would obviously violate this end as well, although drugs that prevent pregnancy or leave people sterile are not in themselves immoral. If a medication is taken for another purpose, say to treat an illness or control one's acne, and one of its side effects happens to prevent pregnancy, this is allowed by virtue of the law of double effect. Of course, the biggest and no doubt most controversial example of lacking openness to new life can be seen in sexual acts among same-sex couples. With the inherent impossibility of conception, the act could never achieve its desired end, and is thus prohibited. This does not mean, though, that just because something is procreative in nature that it is allowed, as both the unitive and procreative ends must be met. If no love is present, the couple enters into an act in a purely clinical, even hostile manner, simply to produce a child. Or worse yet, if one of the partners is forced into the act against their will, even in marriage, the act is gravely insufficient. Sex must be ordered toward the free exchange of love between two people, and not just procreation. For this reason, the Church has taken a pretty strong stance against in vitro fertilization. Besides the justice issues involved, such as the extreme cost and the disposal of unwanted fetuses, the process is flawed even at its core. IVF disconnects procreation from an act of love. Technology can be used to aid the natural act of sex in producing a child, but it can't replace it entirely. Sufficiently uncomfortable hearing a friar talk so much about sex? Well, that makes two of us. But at least we're learning something, right? Without having to go through every possible situation or act, explaining what might make for an exception and what would be prohibited, it should be apparent that there is at least a logic behind the Church's moral teaching. At the very core of everything related to sex are two values. Every act must be unitive and procreative. And while this makes perfect sense, and I have no intention of challenging these principles, I do want to leave you with two questions that are routinely asked of the Church. First, does every individual act have to comprise both of these factors, or can there be a general openness to both? In other words, does the couple have the ability, especially in times of poor health, financial pressure, or even marital struggles, to engage in sexual activity, knowing that they are open to life and love one another on the whole, but maybe just not in that particular moment? The second question is along the same lines, but admittedly is a bit more controversial. Is there a way to maintain the two values presented by the Church, but interpret them in a broader way? For instance, instead of unitive being defined as complementary in nature, could it focus more on the self-giving of the couple? And instead of procreative focusing simply on conception, could we recognize that bearing fruit includes much more, and that raising children with love might be equally, if not more, essential? Officially, the Church maintains that each and every act must satisfy both ends, but one can certainly understand why theologians continue to ask these questions. In understanding these words more broadly, the ends expected by the Church are still met, but our understanding of appropriate sexual conduct changes considerably, involving many things and people previously understood to be outside of moral living. And maybe that's a good thing. Or maybe that just waters down our theology that we profess. Maybe you think it's strange that a celibate man, having taken a lifelong vow of chastity, just spent 9 minutes of your life talking about sex. I don't know. I certainly do not claim to have the right answer to these questions. All I know is that people are asking them and looking for thoughtful answers that make sense of their experience. As sex continues to be the most provocative and controversial subject, both within our church and without, and as societal norms surrounding sexuality continue to evolve with each new generation, how we answer these questions and why we say what we do will have a great impact on our relationship with the world. As moral leaders, those who work to build a just society for the authentic human development of all, we as a church have a lot to say on this subject, and we shouldn't be afraid to share. Whew. Thanks for watching this very awkward episode of Catholicism in Focus. Hopefully it was not too awkward for you. As Christians, we know that there is no aspect of our lives that is separate from God, and so it's important to us that even our most intimate moments reflect our faith. If that's not your cup of tea, no worries, there is plenty of other great content to check out through Breaking in the Habit Media.